As I sat in the car with a bouquet of her favorite flowers on the seat beside me, memories drifted back to when Sophie and I first met. It had been over a decade, but I remembered every detail of that day as if it had happened yesterday. She was standing at the edge of the park, her golden hair blowing in the wind as she laughed with her friends. I was with a group of my own, not paying much attention to the conversation around me, because I couldn't take my eyes off her. She looked so vibrant, so full of life, and something about her just drew me in. I knew I had to go over and talk to her, so I did. I'd never been that confident before, but something about her made me feel like I could be. We hit it off right away, and it wasn't long before our friendship turned into something more. We dated for 2 years, the happiest 2 years I'd ever known. Every moment with her was like a dream. Her laughter, the little quirks she had, how her eyes sparkled when she talked about something she was passionate about. Marrying her was the easiest decision of my life. 10 years had passed since that day, and while our lives had changed, I always thought our love would remain steady. Lately, though, things have been different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that we were drifting, pulled apart by the demands of daily life. My job had kept me busy, too busy if I was honest. Late nights at the office, constant business trips, and endless meetings had left me coming home exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. I noticed Sophie becoming quieter, spending more time in other rooms, her smile fading bit by bit, and it felt like she was slipping away from me. I told myself it was just a phase, that we both needed a break, and that things would settle down soon enough. But deep down, I knew I had to do something. I wasn't about to let this quiet distance between us grow, so I decided to surprise her, to remind her of how much she meant to me. I planned it all out, grabbed her favorite flowers, sunflowers and lilies mixed together, and set off to her office, hoping to catch her as she wrapped up for the day. My goal was simple: make her smile again, see her eyes light up the way they used to. As I drove to her office, my heart raced with anticipation. I thought about the look on her face when she'd see me there, waiting with flowers in hand. The truth was I missed her. I missed us. And I hoped that maybe, with this little gesture, I could bring us closer again. When I pulled up to her building, I sat in the car for a moment, looking up at her window. I could see the faint glow of the office lights, the shadows moving behind the glass. Nervousness began to creep in, but I quickly brushed it off. I told myself this was the right thing to do. Taking a deep breath, I picked up the bouquet and stepped out of the car, excitement bubbling within me as I imagined the surprise and joy on her face when she saw me. Standing by my car, I shifted the flowers in my hand, nervous and excited all at once. My eyes kept darting up to her office window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her before she came down. I thought about how surprised she'd be to see me there, how I'd whisk her away for a night out, just the two of us, leaving behind all the routines and distractions that had come between us. I took a step forward, my eyes settling on the glow of her office light, a faint silhouette moving across the window. Just as I lifted the bouquet a bit higher, ready to walk toward the entrance, I saw another shadow join hers. I didn't recognize it at first, but then he moved closer, too close, and my heart skipped a beat. Her boss. She'd mentioned him a few times, mostly in passing, talking about how he'd recently taken over the team and was bringing fresh ideas and energy into the office. I remembered her describing him, a casual remark about his sharp sense of style, but I'd brushed it off, assuming he was just another face in her professional life. Now, he was right there with her, close enough that I could see his figure leaning in, his hand reaching toward her in a way that felt far too familiar. I took a step back, still holding the flowers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. His hand was on her shoulder, sliding down her arm in a way that felt intimate, possessive. And then I saw her face. She was smiling, not the strained, polite smile she sometimes put on around colleagues, but something softer, more genuine, a kind of warmth I hadn't seen in a long time. It was a look I thought was reserved for us, something private. Her hand rested on his chest as she tilted her head slightly, and for a moment, they both laughed, sharing a connection that seemed to flow naturally between them. I couldn't tear my gaze away. My mind screamed to look somewhere else, to turn and walk inside, to call her and tell her I was here, but I was frozen, watching the scene unfold like some terrible movie. The way she moved with him, leaning closer, laughing, even the way she adjusted her hair. It was as if she had become a different person, confident and entirely comfortable with him. Then, suddenly, he leaned in, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face, and she didn't pull back. Instead, she held his gaze, her lips parting in a way I recognized all too well. My stomach twisted as I watched her draw him in, their faces mere inches apart, until they finally met, her arms wrapping around his neck. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was practiced familiar. She wasn't hesitating. She kissed him with an intensity, a hunger, that shook me to my core. And in that moment, it hit me she hadn't looked at me like that in months, maybe longer. I tried to remember the last time she'd laughed like that, touched me with that same excitement, that same fire. But no matter how much I tried, the memories felt distant, faded. I saw her lean back against the desk, pulling him closer, her hands tracing his back. It was intimate, slow, as if every move was familiar, as if this was far from the first time. My grip on the bouquet tightened, my knuckles white against the flowers as I fought the urge to turn away, to stop looking. But I couldn't. The scene unfolding before me was like a blow to the chest. Each touch, each shared glance, ripping something away from me. She was there with him, in a way I'd thought she would always be with me alone. I dropped the bouquet by the car, my mind numb. It felt as though the world around me was dissolving, leaving only the image of her in his arms. The shock numbed everything else, an ache settling deep in my chest. Somehow, I managed to pull myself away, forcing my legs to move, my breath shallow and uneven. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. Every step away from the building felt heavier than the last, the weight of betrayal pressing down with a force that made it hard to breathe. As I stood there, struggling to process what I was seeing, I felt a surge of dread twist inside me. I hadn't come here prepared for this. Not for the way her hands pulled him close, the way she arched back as if this was some private fantasy they had played out 100 times before. But it wasn't a fantasy. It was my life, our marriage unraveling before my eyes. Frozen in disbelief, I watched as she led him to the edge of her desk, her fingers toying with his collar, her head tilting up to meet his gaze with an almost daring smile. It was a side of her I'd only seen when we were alone, a look reserved for our most private moments. But here she was, freely offering it to someone else, her guard down, her inhibitions abandoned. My breath hitched as he lifted her onto the desk, his hands moving with a familiarity that told me this was no spur-of-the-moment fling. I could see her lips moving, soft laughter mingling with whispered words I couldn't hear. And then, in one fluid motion, she leaned back, her body curving toward him as if this desk was the only place she wanted to be. My fists clenched at my sides, the flowers slipping from my grasp and scattering onto the pavement. I wanted to scream, to run up there and confront her, to shatter this illusion they'd built and remind her of everything we'd shared, of everything I thought we still had. But the shock rooted me in place, like a spectator in my own nightmare. I felt each second drag on, the sounds of the city fading away, until there was nothing but them in that room, nothing but the sight of her in his arms, choosing him over me. Eventually, I turned, stumbling back to my car, numb with disbelief. The weight of what I'd seen crashed down, like a wave too heavy to bear. I didn't know where to go or what to do. My thoughts blurred together, looping back to that image of them on the desk, laughing, her fingers tangled in his hair. I needed something to ground me, something to dull the ache gnawing at my chest. Without another thought, I climbed into the car and drove, nowhere in particular, just anywhere but there. I ended up at a bar a few blocks away, slipping onto a stool in the darkest corner I could find. The bartender glanced at me with a curious look, but I didn't care. I ordered a double whiskey and downed it in one go, hoping the burn would somehow sear away the memory of what I'd seen. But it didn't. It only lingered, replaying in my mind like some cruel, relentless film. The second drink went down just as fast. I could feel a bitter resentment stirring beneath the surface, mingling with a strange, hollow feeling. A few months ago, I'd been sitting across from her at dinner, talking about our future, about plans for a trip we'd always wanted to take. And now here I was, a stranger in my own life, drowning my pain while she was out there with him, living out secrets I never knew she had. I pulled out my phone, almost calling her out of some misplaced urge to confront her, to demand answers. But I stopped myself, my finger hovering over her name. What could I say? That I'd seen everything? That I knew about her and her boss, about the lies and the deceit? None of it would change what she'd done. None of it would undo the betrayal that had cut so deeply it left me reeling, alone, and shattered in a bar miles from home. Instead, I ordered another drink, letting the alcohol numb the ache that had settled deep in my chest. That evening, I sat in the dark waiting. I hadn't planned what I would say, or even what I would do, but the weight of betrayal was a fire raging in my chest, too strong to ignore. The whiskey from the bar barely took the edge off, leaving me teetering between fury and heartbreak as I waited for the sound of her keys at the door. When she finally walked in, the flicker of surprise in her eyes as she saw me sitting in the dimly lit room only fueled my anger. She put her bag down slowly, hesitantly, sensing something was wrong. But the unease in her face was nothing compared to the storm boiling inside me. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. I took a breath, my fists clenched, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I was at your office today." A flash of panic crossed her face, just for a moment, but enough for me to see it. She quickly looked away, pretending to search for something in her bag, but I wasn't about to let her hide behind excuses. I needed the truth, even if it tore me apart. "I saw you, Sophie," I said, my voice sharp. "I saw you and your boss." The words hung heavy in the air, each one sharpening the silence between us. Her face paled, and she stammered, "Adam, it's not. It wasn't what you think." "Then tell me," I challenged, barely containing the bitterness in my voice. "Tell me what it was, because from where I stood, it looked exactly like betrayal." She opened her mouth, searching for words that might make sense of the situation, but all that came out was silence. Eventually, she looked down, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled at the hem of her jacket. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Adam. I never meant for you to find out like this." So it's true. I felt a sick sense of confirmation settle in my gut, but the truth didn't bring any relief. If anything, it deepened the ache. She nodded, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. I didn't plan it. I swear. Things between us, they've been different lately." "Different?" I repeated, incredulous. "You mean because I've been working? Because I've been putting in hours to build a life for us?" She wiped her eyes, frustration coloring her voice. "It's not about the work, Adam. It's that I felt invisible, like you barely saw me anymore. I needed to feel wanted, desired, something I haven't felt from you in so long." I stared at her, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. She felt invisible? All those hours, all those late nights spent thinking about her, about our future, and somehow she felt neglected? It was like the woman in front of me had transformed into someone I barely recognized. "So, you turned to him," I said bitterly, the disgust plain in my voice. "You chose him, your boss, in a place where anyone could see you." She flinched, looking down again, as if the shame was finally sinking in. "I didn't want this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But with him, I felt alive. He noticed me, he listened, he made me feel like I mattered." "Made you feel like you mattered?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "And I didn't? After everything we've been through, after all these years?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe I was just trying to find myself again. I felt like I'd lost who I was, and I didn't know how to tell you. I felt a raw, crushing emptiness inside me. Part of me wanted to reach out, to somehow fix whatever had driven her to this, but I couldn't move past the image of her with him, the intimacy that should have been ours alone, now tainted by someone else. "I need space," I said, my voice hollow. "I need to think about what's left after this." She reached out, her voice pleading. "Adam, please. I know I messed up. I'm begging you. Just give me a chance to make this right." I shook my head, unable to bear the sight of her tear-streaked face. She looked so small, so vulnerable, but I couldn't tell if it was remorse or the fear of losing everything that had finally brought her to this point. Without another word, I grabbed my keys and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the darkened room, realizing for the first time just how much she stood to lose. Sitting alone in the quiet of my car, I stared into the dark, feeling hollow. My mind kept circling back to the same painful question. How did we get here? Had I missed the signs? Overlooked the very things that would have saved our marriage from this cliff? I knew I wasn't perfect. I'd thrown myself into work these last few years, always with good intentions. But now I wondered if I'd unknowingly built the wall that had driven Sophie into someone else's arms. I could picture it all so clearly. All those late nights at the office, the weekends lost to endless emails, the dinners missed with a hurried text about a last-minute deadline. I'd been proud, always thinking I was building something for both of us. But maybe, somewhere in the process, I'd left her behind. As I sat there, memories began to filter in, moments I'd dismissed as small, but now took on a new weight. I thought of the quiet looks she'd give me across the dinner table, her face a mix of weariness and something deeper. She tried to tell me in her own way, hadn't she? A long time ago, I might have reached out, asked her what was wrong. But lately, I chalked it up to routine exhaustion, assuming she'd understand, just as she always had. And then there was that one evening not so long ago, just after her birthday. I'd forgotten to make a reservation at her favorite restaurant. The workday had stretched longer than I'd planned. When I walked in, she was sitting alone on the couch, her gaze distant, the way someone looks at something they've lost but can't admit it's gone. She'd brushed it off, laughing and saying she was fine with takeout, but I remember the look in her eyes, the one that should have told me everything. I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. I let things slide. Maybe I'd even taken her for granted, so focused on building a life for us that I'd forgotten she needed more than just promises and a shared roof. She needed me, my attention, my presence, my understanding. And yet, even with all that self-recrimination, another part of me, the one still raw and stinging from what I'd seen, struggled to understand how her loneliness had led her there, to that office, to him. Was it me who had driven her to it? Had I unknowingly pushed her into seeking something I hadn't provided? I wrestled with the question, turning it over in my mind, searching for answers that wouldn't come. But no matter how much I tried to empathize, a part of me recoiled, stubbornly refusing to condone what she'd done. There had to have been other ways, I told myself. Ways she could have reached me before resorting to betrayal. A sliver of clarity started to form in my mind. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't rewrite the choices either of us had made. But maybe, just maybe, I could try to understand it, to understand her as painful as that might be. If I wanted any hope of moving forward, I realized I needed to give her a chance to explain. I needed to hear it from her, the truth of it all, without the defenses, without the distractions. Just raw honesty. Taking a shaky breath, I gripped the steering wheel, 1,000 emotions swirling inside me. Anger, hurt, regret, and, against all logic, a faint spark of hope. This wasn't something we could undo, but maybe, through the rubble, we could find some piece of understanding that would bring me peace one way or another. With that decision solidifying, I started the car and turned toward home, bracing myself for the confrontation I hadn't been ready for before. This time, though, I would demand honesty, not just about her actions, but about the feelings, the resentment, the truths she'd never shared. And no matter what she said, I knew I'd find my answer. As I stepped into the house, Sophie was already there, her eyes red and puffy. She must have sensed this was more than a fight. This was the kind of moment that changes everything. I looked at her, the person I had loved for so long, but all I saw was a stranger hiding behind familiar eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, needing her to understand the weight of what she had done. Sophie, I started, my voice barely holding steady. I need the truth. Not the pieces you think I can handle. I want everything, all of it. She winced, her face tightening as she sank onto the edge of the couch, her hands wringing together. I know I hurt you, Adam. I know it. She took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself. I felt invisible for so long. You're always at work or thinking about work. I know you do it for us, but I started to feel like I wasn't part of your life anymore." Her words cut deep, each one tearing open wounds I hadn't realized were there. "And that's why you turned to him? Just because I was working?" My voice cracked, somewhere between disbelief and anger. "It's not like that," she replied, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't go looking for it, Adam. At first, it was just attention, just a few words here and there. He'd compliment me, ask me about my day, laugh at my jokes. I felt seen." "You felt seen," I repeated, barely able to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Sophie, you didn't talk to me about any of this. You went straight to him." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, almost ashamed. "I didn't know how to talk to you, Adam. Every time I tried, you were so preoccupied. And I know that's not an excuse, but it just happened. One evening, he told me he admired me, that he found me captivating. He made me feel wanted." I felt a wave of nausea at her words, but I kept my gaze steady. "And that's when it started?" I asked, my voice low. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, it started that night. I thought it would make me feel alive again. I thought it would fill that emptiness I felt." "And did it?" I challenged, my tone sharper than I'd intended. She shook her head slowly. "No, it didn't. It only made things worse. Each time, I felt guilt eating at me. I felt hollow because I knew it wasn't real. You didn't know me the way you do, Adam. You didn't care for me. Not really." Her words felt like ashes in my mouth. I wanted to believe her, but every sentence seemed to pull us further apart. "So, why keep going back?" I asked, trying to understand something I feared I never would. "Because," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I was scared that if I stopped, I'd have to face the reality, that I'd been lying to myself, that what I really needed was you, but I didn't know how to reach you anymore." Her confession hung in the air, each word heavy with regret. She looked up, her face raw and open in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Adam, I know I broke something sacred between us. I know I shattered your trust, but if you give me one more chance, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll work to earn back every ounce of trust one lost." For a moment, the only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock. I could feel her desperation, her sincerity, and yet, I couldn't shake the image of what I'd seen. Her words brought clarity to the hurt, yes, but they didn't erase it. "I need time," I finally said, barely recognizing my own voice. "I need to figure out if I can ever look at you without seeing that betrayal." She nodded, biting her lip to stifle a sob, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. As I turned away, I felt the weight of her gaze on my back, and I knew we were both realizing the same truth. Whatever came next, our lives had irrevocably changed. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying everything Sophie had said, her words echoing in my head like a drumbeat I couldn't escape. Each memory seemed to split my mind in two. One part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that people make mistakes and that maybe, somehow, we could get past this. But the other part, the wounded part, wanted to walk away, to leave the betrayal behind and start fresh. I reached out to my closest friend, Ben, someone I knew would tell me what I needed to hear, not just what I wanted to. We sat down over a couple of beers, and after I'd poured out the whole mess of everything, he looked at me with a mix of sympathy and quiet understanding. "Adam, man," he said, leaning forward, "I can't tell you what to do. But ask yourself, could you ever trust her again? Could you ever look at her without seeing—" "Well, you know." I nodded, taking a sip, thinking about how my first instinct had been to surprise her, to make her feel special. But now, everything felt tainted. I couldn't remember a single moment of our life together that didn't feel like a lie. Ben let the silence linger for a moment, then added, "You deserve someone who's all in. Someone who would have the hard conversations instead of finding shortcuts around them. If you stay, are you staying because you really think it'll work? Or because you're afraid of letting go?" That question lingered with me long after our conversation ended. The next day, I met with a counselor to get some guidance on how to navigate the whirlwind of emotions. I laid out everything: the betrayal, Sophie's reasons, my doubts, and the weight of our history. The counselor listened quietly, her expression calm and empathetic. When I was done, she leaned forward, her words gentle but direct. Adam, he said, forgiveness is one thing, but rebuilding trust takes more than just words. It requires actions, time, and a willingness to let go of the hurt. It's normal to love someone and still know that they may not be the right person for you anymore. That hit home, because deep down I knew I still loved Sophie. Despite it all, I felt connected to her, a part of me that didn't want to let go. But love, I realized, wasn't the only ingredient needed to make a marriage work. Trust was just as important, if not more so. And Sophie had taken that trust and shattered it. As the days went on, I replayed the moments over and over in my mind, remembering the look in her eyes, the way she begged for another chance, her admission of feeling unseen and undesired. Yet, I'd given her so much of myself over the years, had always tried to show her she was loved and valued. Maybe not in every way she wanted, but in the ways I knew how. Then finally it happened. One evening, sitting alone in the quiet of our living room, I felt a sense of clarity, like a weight lifting from my chest. The answer had been right in front of me all along. I didn't need to settle for someone who could choose to betray me. I deserved a partner who would fight through the hard times with me, not turn to someone else when things got tough. With that realization, a calm washed over me. I knew what I had to do. I had to choose myself, to move forward without the betrayal overshadowing every future interaction, every conversation, every glance. As much as I had loved her, I knew now that I couldn't stay, not without losing a part of myself. When Sophie came home that evening, I met her in the kitchen, and for the first time, I saw her for who she was: flawed, broken, and no longer the person I wanted to share my life with. Sophie, I began, my voice steady. I've made my decision. I think it's best if we let each other go. She stared at me, a mixture of devastation and resignation in her eyes. I knew she had expected this, had perhaps known it was inevitable. As much as it hurt to see her reaction, I felt a sense of liberation, knowing I was finally choosing to leave the past behind. In the end, we parted ways amicably. There was no screaming, no blame, just two people who had loved once but no longer belonged together. And as I walked away, I felt a bittersweet peace settle over me, ready to start a new chapter, free from the shadows of betrayal. The decision to separate from Sophie, though clear in my mind, didn't make the process any easier. Telling her felt like unearthing every single memory, every laugh, every late-night conversation we'd ever shared, only to watch them all unravel at once. I was ready to move on, but the reality of cutting ties with someone who had been my partner for so long was like letting go of a piece of myself. I sat across from her in the dim light of our kitchen one evening, the place where we'd built so much of our life together. I'd spent the last few nights sleeping in the guest room, trying to gather my thoughts. But now, facing her, I knew there was no easy way to say it. Sophie, I began, my voice steady but heavy. We need to move forward separately. I think it's best if we end things. She went quiet, absorbing my words. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the regret that had been lingering since that day I'd confronted her. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of it all was finally pressing down on her. But I had to stand my ground, knowing that, for both our sakes, I couldn't stay any longer. She whispered, Adam, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but it doesn't mean I don't love you. I took a deep breath. I know, Sophie. I know you love me in your own way. But love isn't enough if there's no trust. I can't move past what happened. It's changed everything between us. I deserve someone who will be all in, and so do you. The silence hung between us, thick and uncomfortable, as if we both wanted to rewind time, to change the course of what had happened. But we couldn't undo it. And I'd come to realize that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and I couldn't forget. The next few days were a blur. We agreed on how to divide the things we had built together, from our shared possessions to our routines. We each moved through the house carefully, deliberately, sorting what was hers from what was mine, knowing that each decision symbolized the final separation of our lives. One evening, as I packed up my things, I looked around the house, memories flashing in every corner. The first meal we'd cooked together in that kitchen, lazy Sunday mornings on the couch, the late nights working at the dining table. Everything reminded me of the life we'd built. And yet now, it felt like I was seeing it from a distance, as if it was someone else's story entirely. I moved my things to a small apartment across town, a modest place, but one that felt refreshing, unburdened by history. Standing in that empty space, I felt both lonely and liberated. There was nothing here to remind me of the pain, nothing that pulled me back into the past. It was a blank canvas, ready for something new. As I settled into my new life, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Love, I realized, wasn't just about romance or shared memories. It was about respect, about the simple act of choosing each other every day. Sophie had chosen something else, and though it hurt, I knew now that I couldn't compromise on trust and loyalty. My days slowly took shape, a routine that brought a strange kind of peace. Mornings started with coffee on my small balcony, watching the city come to life, reminding myself of the independence I had regained. In the evenings, I found solace in rediscovering old hobbies. Things I'd put aside for the sake of busy schedules, things I'd forgotten brought me joy. There were difficult days, moments when I'd look at an old photo or recall a random memory that tugged at my heart. But with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more assured that I had made the right choice. I wasn't living in the shadow of betrayal anymore, and that freedom was worth every ounce of pain it had taken to get here. In time, I found myself more open, reconnecting with friends, meeting new people, and finding joy in the simple things. And though I wasn't ready for another relationship just yet, I felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. I was beginning to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing, and becoming stronger. I knew Sophie would find her own path, and that she'd have to reckon with her choices, just as I'd had to face mine. But my journey was now my own, untethered and open to whatever lay ahead. And as I stood on the edge of this new chapter, I finally felt ready to leave the pain behind and embrace the unknown, with a heart that was, despite everything, hopeful and open. The weeks after moving into my new place were a strange mix of relief and quiet reflection. The absence of Sophie's presence and the silence in my apartment felt stark at first, but each day became a step forward. The emptiness was no longer just a reminder of what was lost. It was space to rebuild, to fill with my own choices, routines, and new experiences. I'd begun to see this time as a chance to rediscover the parts of myself I had set aside. Simple things brought me comfort. Saturday morning hikes in the nearby woods, evenings with an old guitar I hadn't played in years, reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from. Bit by bit, I began to feel lighter, as if I was finally shedding the weight of all those years and what they had come to represent. One day, I received a message from Sophie. She asked if we could meet. Not to rekindle things, she assured, but to have a final conversation for closure. I thought long and hard about it, wondering if opening old wounds was worth it. But I realized I no longer felt the same anger or sadness. I was finally ready to let go, fully and without bitterness, and agreed to meet. Sitting across from her at a small cafe, I was surprised by how familiar and yet distant she felt. Sophie looked nervous, her hands twisting her ring absent-mindedly. After a moment, she began, "Adam, I'm sorry. Truly, I think I lost myself somewhere along the way, and I took you down with me. You didn't deserve that." Her words stirred something in me, but not the pain I had once felt. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of peace, an understanding that both of us were simply two people who had tried and failed in ways that had once seemed unimaginable. I looked at her and nodded, feeling a release in the acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, surprised at how calm my voice was. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what went wrong, but I know now that we were both hurting in our own ways. I hope you find what you're looking for. She gave a small, sad smile, and for the first time, I truly believed we both could move forward without resentment. That final conversation, simple as it was, lifted the last remnants of hurt and confusion that had lingered within me. As I walked away, I realized that I'd finally let go of the weight of betrayal. I didn't need to understand everything, nor did I need every answer. What mattered was that I had moved through it, and now it was behind me. The next few months became a season of growth. I took on new projects at work, poured myself into hobbies, and even met people who reminded me of the joys of connection and openness. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer defining myself by what had happened. I was Adam again, a man who had been hurt, but who had emerged on the other side, whole and ready for whatever came next. Each day felt like a fresh start, and the world seemed filled with new possibilities. I knew the journey had changed me, made me stronger and wiser, and I was grateful for it. I was free from the past, free from the shadow of betrayal, and finally ready to embrace the future with a hopeful heart. As I closed my door that night in my quiet, cozy apartment, I felt a deep sense of peace. The past was exactly where it belonged, and my future lay ahead, bright and open, waiting for me to step into it without looking back.